I am part of infinity, the spiritual journey of Albert Einstein. There he is. And by the way, I have him here as our friend. I hauled this thing down from home, so I'm going to show it to you. Here it is, the actual statue. This is the modeled on the statue in Washington, D.C. It's right there close to the Smithsonian's. Anyway, I guess I can have it there, sort of. He'll just join us here
Yeah,
on our spiritual journey.
three-way
Karen, nice
podcast.
to see you. Congratulations on the book. It's a good book. I read the whole thing. I mean, how could you not be interested in whatever Einstein has to say? So, but before we get into all that, you talk about your own personal journey a little bit at the beginning of the book. Break it down for us. What's your story?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks so much for having me, Michael. So glad you read the whole book. That's amazing. Yeah, I talk about my personal story a little bit. It's a long journey that came to this book. I mean, started off, I was really interested in dreams when I was quite young. My dad was writing down dreams, and I got into sort of that side of the mind, subconscious, Jung, and so on. Got into meditation very early in life. Went and spent quite a while in India and Nepal, living with Tibetan monks, trying to learn the Tibetan language. Not very successfully, I'll admit. Um, and eventually, did the academic training you mentioned, neuroscience, PhD, studying the brain basis of meditation, and then med school. And I started working on a book about that side of things, kind of the science of meditation and spirituality, which is actually going to end up being my second book.
Mm.
And in the meantime, I was kind of looking for examples of great scientists or other people who are kind of already renowned or known in the scientific world who also had a spiritual side that maybe people didn't know about. And of course, I came across some of these quotes by Einstein in the book, which I mentioned, called Quantum Questions. It's like an anthology that Ken Wilber put together of kind of the spiritual mystical writings of the quantum physicists and Einstein as well. And I just saw some of those quotes and I thought, there's a story here that has to be told. And in my naivete, as my first book, I thought it would be quick and easy to write something focused on Einstein's spirituality. And of course, it ended up taking almost 4 years actually to get it start to finish. So
Wow.
that's how the personal story kind of turned into this book.
There is something about quantum physics and spirituality or consciousness or altered states of consciousness and all that that seems to come together in a lot of people's minds. Quantum is, as the saying goes, quantum physics is spooky and weird, and consciousness is spooky and weird. So maybe they have some connection.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think I'm not a physicist, so I think it's very easy for a lot of people now to sort of anchor on what you were saying, which is that quantum physics is weird and we don't understand it, and there's strange things going on, and so is the mind. So there must be some connection there. But I think the way the quantum physicists wrote about it was much more in the tradition. I think their interest in consciousness was not quite as deep, and sort of it wasn't so much about quantum theories of consciousness or weird quantum randomness allows for free will. It was much more that the mind is attuning in some sense to a deeper reality when it understands physics on that level of depth and that level. So when you're getting into unified theories of things or the deep structure of matter or the stability of the rest of the cosmos, something really strange is happening where the mind isn't so much just picking up information from outside, but is almost attuning itself to this cosmic harmony, this cosmic order, which I'm sure we'll discuss later. And that came from a very old idea from the Pythagoreans, that math is not just a method of science. It's not just a way to come up with a good model, but it's actually almost like a mystical path of some kind.
Yeah, right. Because what is mathematics? Is it something we just invented, or is it out there somewhere? Like the mathematical universe. The equations are not floating around out there, but what the equations represent, they represent something that's really out there, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's the idea.
Yeah. I think to be determined, it's such a hard question to think about. And there's a funny story. One of my best friends who read the book in the very beginning as a mathematician, used to be a math teacher, and we ended up having a discussion about this on a road trip on our way back from a trip in Northern California back to the city. We got so deep into that discussion. Is this really part of the universe, or is it just a really, really effective mental model? We
Mhm.
ended up in Sacramento. Um, and, looked up at the sign. It's like entering Sacramento. Like, that's not on the way to San Francisco. We got to turn off here.
That's
So
too
I think
funny.
it's the effectiveness. There's a great paper, I think I said it in the book, called "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences." I think it's Henri Poincaré, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken. Um, and I think a lot of physicists have kind of broken their brains thinking about this. Like, is it really real? Is this kind of God's language, or the language of the universe, or is it just some really really good trick that we've hit on somehow? So,
Yeah. And then when you undertake a project about what Einstein believed about anything, I mean, it's a massive body of literature. I mean, other than maybe Darwin in the history of science, maybe Newton, but probably not. Has anyone written more about anyone than Einstein?
yeah, that's a good point, and I think it's a blessing and a curse.
Yeah. Where do you
On one
start?
level, yeah, on one level, there's so much, and also so much has been written, and I repeatedly, while I was working on the book, I came across, some people's articles on this topic, and I was like, oh no, someone else has already done this, and they've got all, they've mined all the good quotes, and there's nothing new to say. But obviously, as I kept going, I realized there was a lot to say, and I think it's kind of incredible that it's been hiding in plain sight, because aside from some things I found in the archives in his personal books and his handwritten notes and so on, most of what's in the book has been translated into English. Even I don't read German. There's a few things I translated from French, but most of it's out there and it's published under his name. But it's scattered all over the place, and I think you need kind of the right eye to see it as well, and not just force it into, this is atheism or it's deism or something else, but this is something different that has precedence historically, but is not very well known today, in terms of, Pythagorean worldview or a
Hmm.
pantheistic worldview. So I think it's kind of a mix of, there was a lot of digging. I'm not going to lie. It was a
Hmm.
lot of fruitless reading of all kinds of books and people's memoirs where they were quoting Einstein. But um, yeah,
Yeah. Well, so in reading the book, let me just go out on a limb here and just float an idea by you. How much of Einstein's religiosity or spirituality or whatever the right word is, we can deconstruct those words in a minute, but was kind of intact and developed, fully formed in his own mind and lifetime? Or how much of it have you cobbled together into kind of a coherent worldview in which you're saying Einstein had a lot of really great ideas? We should take those and put them together and run with it in this age where the rise of the nuns, spiritual but not religious, people are looking for meaning and something deeper. Hey, here's an idea. Einstein had these great ideas. Let's kind of take what he did, put it together, and go forward with it.
Yeah, I think that's actually something I constantly worried about working on the book, because his own expressions of the cosmic religion are quite brief little articles or even speeches. And it's not like he wrote a whole book about this and sort of laid out his whole philosophy in a systematic way. So there was a lot of cobbling together. And that's partly why I did really careful sourcing and, pointed out every quote and mentioned the context and so on in the endnotes. Um, but at the same time, my feeling from reading it, it's just not something I can prove, but it's definitely how I feel about it after all the research, is that actually it's very, very simple. The essence of his spirituality, it's not some complex philosophical system. It's based on a very small handful, maybe three or four key ideas. And everything kind of follows from those ideas um, if you sort of extrapolate from them naturally. And those ideas are, non-dualism on some deep level, kind of metaphysical or ontological level. And he's not the first person by any means to think that nonviolence follows as the sort of obvious ethical implication of a non-dualist
Hmm.
view of the world. And nor is he the first person to say, a non-dualist idea of reality is kind of like pantheism, because if everything's kind of one thing and it creates everything and it is everything and everything beautiful and everything ugly and evil, it's all kind of one thing that can express itself in an infinite number of ways. That's for Einstein, for Spinoza, for the authors of the Upanishads. That is what many people today would call God, although it's not, it's a very different notion of what God is, of course. So I think, yeah, to sum it up, I think I cobbled together the quotes is how I'd put it, but I think I'm pretty certain that they are an accurate reflection of kind of what Einstein extrapolated from a few
Yeah.
quite straightforward ideas. Yeah.
Uh, so you mentioned, 3 or 4 key ideas. So the first, non-dualism. What's the second one? We'll come back to these in detail, but just
Yeah.
get them
I
on the
think
table here.
nonviolence. So that's kind of the ethical implication. And
Mhm.
then pantheism is kind of the intermediary between those two in some
Mm.
sense. And then Pythagoreanism is, I think, kind of the epistemological method, or almost the faith-based aspect of it, if you want to call it that.
Mm.
I think one place in the book I call it, the only axiom Einstein ever really accepted without evidence is the Pythagorean faith, that there is an orderly harmony, and because we're part of it and we share the same nature as it, we can also understand it with the human mind.
I
So
see. Yeah. Well, non-dualism, I guess I'm a non-dualist, but so is my friend Deepak Chopra, but he's a monist. I'm a monist. I'm a materialist monist. He's a consciousness monist, I guess. Consciousness is fundamental. It's primary. It's, what does he say? The ground of all being, which, he got from, well, Tillich, I guess, who described God as the God of all, the ground of all being. Yeah, okay. So I guess it depends on where you start. What's at the fundamental base of everything, right?
yeah,
And at some point, you're just digging into the bedrock looking for some, there it is, there's the bottom.
yeah,
But how do you know if you've reached the bottom?
yeah, yeah. I don't have an answer for that. I wish
I
I could
don't
tell
think
you.
anybody does.
Yeah. I think the key yeah, I'm kind of using non-dualism as a synonym, more or less, or an analogy for monism. And I think the difference with Einstein would be that matter, and he's following Spinoza very carefully or very closely here, is that it's neither mind nor matter is fundamental. Those are two different modes of the infinite something underneath, which Einstein called the arch force, sometimes Spinoza called substance, with a capital S. And Einstein used that word as well. And I think that's definitely how I understand it. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that view, is that there is some underlying the ground or the substance, and to call it primarily mental or primarily material, both of those are kind of a simplification or a misunderstanding of what it is, because it can just as easily become either one of those or
Hmm,
give rise to either one of those.
hmm.
And so it's kind of, we're still kind of stuck in that dualistic, no, it has mind's more important, or matter comes first and then there's mind. And I think what Spinoza and Einstein would both say is that those are both inherent in this ground, and there's no real precedence of one or the other.
Yeah. Okay, a couple other foundational ideas. What do you mean by spirituality, and how do you think about that differently from, say, religion? And if you want to throw Einstein's ideas in there too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's sort of in the eye of the beholder, of course, right? I mean, I think the way I think of religion, I was raised in a totally secular household. I'm kind of the only person in my family who has any real interest in these things, or any deep interest. And Um, for me, my image of religion is kind of churches and temples, and it's more the outward forms and the beliefs you're supposed to subscribe to, and the books you're supposed to read, and the certain saints you're supposed to respect. Um, and I've never really been involved with that. I didn't grow up with that at
Hmm.
all. But the spiritual side for me is more the feelings themselves, the kind of intrinsic impulse to sort of seek the sacred or seek some understanding of our place in the universe. That's how I look at spiritual things, which is, and those can overlap enormously with religion, but the spiritual but not religious, as you mentioned, are people who are like, yeah, I'm interested in these things. Maybe I'm interested in meditation or psychedelics or lucid dreaming. I'm interested in these deep philosophical questions, but I'm not interested in using one book or one framework to explain all this. And I think that's essentially how Einstein understood it. Is there's a great quote, I don't remember who it's from, but I put it in the book, where it's, the student or the beneficiary of all traditions, but the slave to none.
Hmm.
And so, there's pieces of truth, there's great ideas, there's great moral insights and traditions all over the world, but there's really no reason I can see in this day and age to sort of be stuck with one and limit yourself in that way.
Certainly, yes. Yeah, I had Decker Keltner on the show. His book is called Awe,
Yeah.
and it's about the study of awe. Turns out, it's very subjective, but, there is a well-defined sense that people have when they do X, whatever that is, walk along the beach barefoot, or go out under the night sky with the stars, or, just out in nature, beautiful music, dance, meditation. There's just lots of different avenues to that. But maybe, is that what you mean? And do you think what Einstein meant about spirituality, and, I don't know, it kind of communing with the idea of infinity, whatever that is, and eternity, and, these kind of big ideas that make you just sort of feel like I don't know, like wow or
Yeah.
awe.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, and I didn't include a lot of them in the book just because they didn't really fit, but Einstein mentioned this often when he's in nature, when he's out sailing, seeing the stars on a steamship in the middle of the ocean. He often mentioned this similar kind of feeling when he's out in nature. But I think the kind of the key difference for him and the other scientists of his generation is that um, the highest form of kind of rational thinking or rigorous scientific reasoning, mathematical models can lead to that same feeling. So it's not just kind of being out in nature or wow, the universe is big and beautiful. It's that same feeling can come from mathematical insight and from the insight of actual discoveries that stand the test of time, and that for all intents and purposes, within the limits of our understanding at least, are true. And these models, you know, the quantum physics model, the standard model of particle physics, general relativity, these things have held true for many, many decades now, or over 100 years in the case of general relativity. So it's kind of rarefying that impulse almost to a degree that's hard for normal people to understand, because these people were thinking on a level that most of us can't come close to. So it's, what if you can refine that feeling and mix it with scientific rigor and with mathematics, and not just feel awe for the larger thing you're part of, but sort of bring back an understanding of that, or infer it, or induce somehow, have insight into how that bigger thing works and how you're connected to it.
Right. Yeah, it's not like I'm gonna have a dream about riding on a beam of light and come up with relativity theory.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
you have
This
to be
is
you have to have a prepared mind to come up with that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's actually one of my favorite parts in the book. Is it's pretty short, but where I try to tie it in with, in all these religious traditions, the visionary journey is central. You leave your body in some sense, or you travel up to the celestial realm or the stars, and you have some divine revelation, and you're instructed by the gods or the angels or something, and you come back with, a different understanding or a religious mission that you're on. And that's kind of the archetypal pattern in pretty much every religion and in shamanic traditions as well. And the physicists, I think, in some way, really have harnessed that same ability to sort of use the imagination to the utmost, and come back with something very, very unexpected and kind of unprecedented historically, but which is more and more common today. So,
Yeah. Yeah, you quote here, Einstein called it cosmic religion, in which he said, "I am part of infinity." There's the title of your book.
yeah.
What did he mean by that?
Yeah. So, that's a direct quote. And as soon as I read it in one of the books I was researching, I knew that
There's
was the
my
title.
title.
Yeah, instantly, I was like, "That's the title," and the
Yeah.
publisher doesn't like it, I'm gonna fight them on it because I love it. That's perfect. And he was actually paraphrasing Spinoza, who said, that I don't have to paraphrase him because I don't remember the exact quote, but that's kind of the highest realization in Spinoza's system, is for the mind to understand that it's a part of nature. And Spinoza, for him, nature was capital N nature, synonymous with God in his own terminology. So, or with that substance we talked about earlier. So, um, I'm a part of the substance, the ground of being, is what he was trying to say there. And I love it partly because it sort of has a mathematical ring to it, almost,
Mhm.
infinity and infinite sets and so on. So it kind of hints at that a little bit. But also because it's in the first person, and so you can't even read the title of the book without getting the message on some level. And I kind of love that you just sort of really encapsulated it in just a few words. So,
By the way, Spinoza, that's who is, in that painting above
oh
Einstein's head there, which you can't quite see too well.
yeah,
Now, here, I'll
perfect
tell you,
placement. You got
yeah,
Spinoza right behind Einstein, his muse.
that was the painting by Pat Lindsay, who is featured, behind me here on the cover of Skeptic. She passed away a couple years ago, back in the old days when magazine covers were actual paintings. And here's the cover of the issue of Skeptic, with Spinoza on it. There he is right there.
Yeah, and that's a great
In
quote from
which,
him.
yeah,
I love.
I've made a ceaseless effort not to ridicule, not to bewail, not to scorn human actions, but to understand them. Yeah, that's kind of our motto. Yeah, infinity is it's just a crazy idea. I was watching a documentary about this, bunch of physicists and mathematicians talking about, if infinity and eternity are real, then everything will happen that can happen will happen. You and I are going to have the same conversation a trillion years from now or something, or pretty close to it. It's just like, what? How is that possible? Yeah. I mean,
I've,
it is
I,
a difficult idea to grasp.
yeah, I've actually never understood that implication, and maybe it's because I'm just not good enough with math. But I thought things like pi, like the ratio pi, had already kind of proven to mathematicians that you can have something infinite that doesn't repeat and that doesn't have any pattern whatsoever. And so I don't quite understand that leap actually between infinity and kind of eternal recurrence is what it sounds like you're saying, kind of
Hmm.
Nietzschean idea that if enough time, then there has to be repetition. But it seems, again, from the example of pi, that you could have something infinite, but it's never the same and never repeats as well.
Well,
So
like the multiverse, there's a trillion or an infinite number of other universes where people close to you and I are having this very similar conversation. And I was like, okay, all right. I'll tell you a funny story. My 8-year-old, he must have just been hearing about this in school. He goes to a Montessori school, so they do a lot on numbers, and they have these number cubes and strings and cubes, and the numbers just get bigger and bigger. And he said, "What's the number just before infinity?" I thought, okay, he's messing with me here. Right? Because he has to know, well, there is no there is no
yeah,
final number, so the one just before that one can't possibly anyway. But it's a funny question because it's like what is infinity? It's just crazy. But maybe that's the point of having the concept, or maybe these are sometimes called Mysterian mysteries. The
mhm,
Mysterians are with these philosophers that believe there are certain problems that can never be solved, not even in principle, because our brains are not big enough. They're big
yeah.
enough to be able to ask the question and think about it, but we just can't ever get there because,
Yeah, I think that's how I would understand it and explain it is that it's not a strict concept. It's much more meant to be something. It's almost like a Zen koan. It's supposed to break your brain a little bit and be bewildering. And I don't know if you realize you're just paraphrasing again one of my favorite quotes from Einstein, which is near the end of the book, is that we've been endowed with just enough intelligence to see just how
yeah.
um, inadequate that intelligence actually is to understand everything. And so, we can be conscious and we can ask questions and we can get a hold of a bit of the truth. But at the same time, understanding the real basis of things is just really beyond us and
Yeah.
kind of
I actually think,
accepting that part of the religion, right?
yeah, I
Or part
forgot that Einstein said that, right? Maybe that's where the Mysterian philosophers got that idea. Um, but that, maybe if we had a brain the size of Jupiter or something, just,
Mhm,
something just massively bigger, we'd be able to construct it. But, conceptually, like the hard problem of consciousness, what's it like to be something? Well,
mhm.
how would I know? I'm just me, right? I don't
Yeah,
even know what it's like to be you. I can kind of take a guess because at least you're human, so you probably have similar neurochemistry as I have, and
yeah,
so on and so forth. But a bat or a dolphin or it's
yeah.
just the way the question is even asked. I'm not sure that's ever going to get us to the answer.
Yeah. I think my favorite answer to that, which I don't talk about in the book because again, it just didn't quite fit in, but Schopenhauer explained that, I think, in a really interesting way. And as I'm sure you know, Einstein was really into Schopenhauer, and that was
Yeah.
kind of introduction to a lot of Eastern ideas, was through Schopenhauer into the Upanishads and non-dualism. And he made a really, I'm paraphrasing, but he made a really interesting point that said there's an interior or kind of a feeling, phenomenal consciousness, a feeling what it is to be like pretty much everything, but you just can't know what it is. And it's going to be simpler if
Mm.
you're an atom, say, or a rock. And he said, if a rock had the level of consciousness we had, it would feel like when you throw it, it's kind of taking flight and it wants to go in this direction. But what we feel as conscious beings and our feeling of freedom is just a really, really high level version of what is potentially happening or potentially possible anywhere in reality into every little part of the cosmos, he said.
Yeah. Okay, before we get into Einstein's ideas, could you give us a little potted biography of his own journey? He was, secular Jew or whatever, and how did he get into all these ideas? What was his upbringing like in terms of religiosity and spirituality and all that?
Yeah. Where to begin? I think part of what I also sort of gleaned from the research is that a lot of these things I think were kind of intrinsic to him. I think he just sort of had this natural feeling that the world is a numinous, mysterious place. that pacifism is kind of the right ethical approach, and that's pretty clear from these anecdotes from when he was really small of despising military parades and crying when he sees soldiers walk past. So I think in some sense we were talking earlier about me cobbling stuff together, but I think in some sense he kind of cobbled together ideas that already resonated with what he felt kind of instinctively as a child, and so that sort of mistrust and hatred of militarism and violence. But then also there's a great story which he put in his own autobiography. Actually, he wrote a brief autobiography near the end of his life, and he emphasizes this as a really important moment for him is when his uncle gives him a compass, and he can see that you can move the compass, but the needle stays in the same place, and it kind of trembles in response to some unknown force, and always points a certain way. And I think that that really encapsulates everything. And it's like the physical analog to the saying "I'm a part of infinity." Is that this little needle? Like why does it obey this? Why does it behave this way? What is this force? And it's not really local. We're talking about even specifically on the Earth is this huge magnetic field that's part of the whole planet, and yet this little piece has really no choice almost but to align with it and obey this much larger sort of tapestry that it's embedded in. And so he again he emphasizes that in his own autobiography as kind of the key moment when he realized there's this big mysterious force all around us of some kind. And I love that scene because his uncle tells him, I don't know. And his uncle, I think, was a electrical engineer or electrician. And he said, I don't know what this is. We don't understand what electromagnetism is. Scientists are still trying to understand it. And if you don't understand something, call it X and then keep looking until you find out what X is. And I think Einstein definitely took that to heart. And, later in his life, this fruitless search, of decades for this unified field theory, that's what he was looking for was, can I explain the ultimate force that, unites gravity, unites electromagnetism, makes everything kind of reducible to a single field, essentially, or the divine ground we were talking about earlier. That was the quest of his final decades. And ultimately he failed, of course. But I think you get these origins very early on that kind of foreshadow what he spent his mature years working on. Um, there's a lot more to be said. We could focus it a bit if you like, but I mean, he also had some really great friends when he was younger, in his kind of college years when he was studying physics, and they formed what they called the Olympia Academy kind of as a joke because they were, poor students, and many of them, some of them were Jewish and weren't really welcome in the upper echelons of, polite society. And they formed their own little, faux academic group and read, Spinoza, and they read the great physicists and other books of philosophy. And they would talk, and there's great anecdotes of them talking about these ideas all night long, smoking cigarettes and just having snacks and then going up to hike for sunrise after reading, Spinoza and other philosophers all night long and debating the ideas. So I think he's exposed to a lot of really interesting friends, some of whom became mathematicians, one of whom became like an expert on ancient Greek thought and sent Einstein his books on Democritus, for example. Um, and I think even before that, many people, I think it's very important to give credit to, there's this medical student who would have dinner with them sometimes. He was kind of a poor student from out of town, and it was an old Jewish tradition to invite, a traveling or a wandering Jew over for dinner once in a while. So he would come by, and he realized, Einstein, I think, was 12 or 13 when they first met. And he realized this is a really special kid. This is a very precocious young man, and ended up giving him all this higher literature, books on science, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which Max Talmy is the guy's name. He said that Einstein was reading when he was 13 years old, and then
Unbelievable.
started handing him, books of higher mathematics. So I think all these things come very early. And then of course later in life, Einstein starts reading, voraciously and studying these things and deliberately traveling all over the world to sort of experience different cultures firsthand. But the awe of this sort of larger force that we're embedded in, um, the instinctive kind of revulsion for violence, the exposure to this really deep, rational but kind of mystical philosophy, the way like Kant's critiques, higher mathematics, all these things he was exposed to really, really early in life. So
Yeah, as a biographer there, you're looking at different sources of information about your subject. So the books he has on his shelf is a pretty interesting idea. You don't usually
yeah,
think about that. How do you know he read them? Well, you kind of
Yeah.
flip through them, and he had that little diagonal slash line
Yeah.
indicating I want to come back to this passage, or this is important to me, or something like that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. That's definitely one of the more magical parts of working on the book, I think, because it started off, like I said, just kind of a wild idea. I was like, oh, I can write a quick, short book on Einstein's spirituality. And in my mind, I was just from looking at some of the quotes and his ideas, having spent a lot of my life engaged with Eastern spirituality, I could see the obvious influence. And then I knew he'd read Schopenhauer and really adored Schopenhauer, and I'd read that as well. So I said, okay, there's an obvious connection here, and I know where he got some of these sources. This will be a quick book, evidence for Eastern influence on Einstein. But there's so much more to it that I didn't expect, of course. And I found out about the Einstein archives very early on and emailed them. And I said, what do you have? And can I visit? And they said, yeah, sure. And I said, I read somewhere that he had a lot of books and he read all these books, and were those preserved? And they said, yeah, we have everything. And here's the spreadsheet. Here's an Excel sheet with every book. And I went through that and saw all these things, as I mentioned in the book, 5 different translations of the Tao Te Ching, for example, the Analects of Confucius, Chuang-Tzu as well, all these Greek philosophers. And so, again, I think there's something really interesting there. And then, like you said, how do you know he read them? And it's really hard to know in a lot of cases because he wasn't writing dense treatises on his spirituality with footnotes or anything like that. He very rarely cites anyone in particular. But you do find these occasional, very rare handwritten markings, and he didn't do that in almost any of his books. And the ones he did, I think, are quite revealing and really interesting, including passages from Gandhi, for example. A lot of markings in the Tao Te Ching, and also quite a few in his book on Democritus, who was the atomist philosopher who was also in the Pythagorean tradition. So, yeah.
Yeah, back in the 80s, I read The Tao of Physics, Fritjof Capra's first
Yeah.
big book. And then The Turning Point, and there was a documentary based on that. Yeah, and I thought there, maybe there was something to that, and then there were some scientists that were critical of that. Steve Gould, for example, wrote a critical review of I think it was The Tao of Physics, that he likes holism, but his is a more of a East Coast New Yorker holism rather than a California holism. To
Yeah.
which I had Fritjof Capra on the show. He goes, "Yep, that's true. I'm
Yeah.
guilty." Very Californian. But there
Yeah.
is something, right? Because is it possible that the Eastern philosophers and sages did tap into some kind of deeper truths, albeit through a different medium than math or physics or whatever?
Yeah, and I think Einstein's by no means the only one to sort of make these connections. And Wolfgang Pauli, who is featured in the book a fair bit, is
Right.
also really into this, really into Taoism, very interested, and Erwin Schrödinger as well. And those are the 2 guys of that group who are probably the closest to Einstein in their beliefs, and very, very close friends and relations to him. Um, Also, Schrodinger read a huge amount of Eastern literature, which is, well documented in his the biography. I think it's Moore wrote the biography of him, if I remember correctly. And uh, I think the connection, it's kind of a not semantics, but it's just sort of it's tough to say exactly how connected they are, or how much was foreshadowed, and how much is sort of we're reading back into it. But certainly the people who founded those theories and built our modern understanding of physics thought there was something really interesting there that was worth studying. So,
And who was it that Pauli had a correspondence with? Was it Jung?
yeah, and I mean they met in person, so they had letters and therapy sessions and just deep discussions. They ended up writing a book together as well, which
Right,
is
that's
not
right.
so much a co-written, but it's two halves, 2 sides of the book, and a very deep relationship. And Pauli actually was the first kind of famous person to endorse the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, which is of course a huge deal now, but at the time it was kind of breaking out on his own, and he was up against the whole Freudian school. And
Mm.
it was, I think, a very big deal for him to have a Nobel Prize winning kind of genius endorsing his institute and lending his prestige to it as well for the sort of intellectual side. So, yeah, and that's again a really fascinating relationship where I mentioned in the book that Einstein, for all his sort of support of this idea that there's some one ground or there's one divine source and our minds are part of it, he was kind of stayed focused on physics. He didn't really dive into that. He didn't, meditate. He was well aware of these things. He saw monks meditating. He talked with Buddhist monks in Japan, but he didn't sit down to meditate. Freud himself offered psychoanalysis to Einstein, offered to analyze him, and he's like, "No, thanks. I think it might be better to just leave that alone." And Pauli, on the other hand, um, again, I'm not a physicist, but from what I understand, is widely considered kind of second only to Einstein in terms of his
Mhm.
genius and his originality of his contributions. And he went the other path. He dived really deep into this stuff. And part of it is because he had no choice in a way. His personal life was a total mess, and he was essentially an alcoholic, and he really, really needed help. So he turned to Carl Jung. But it's kind of a fascinating case study of what if Einstein had started analyzing his dreams with Carl Jung, or had gotten deep into meditation. I think he'd probably be saying similar things, but maybe it would be even more of a kind of obvious story, and we all would have known it before now. So
That's funny. Yeah, his dream about falling down an elevator shaft where he intuits that, the object next to you falling at your same speed is going to be like zero gravity, right? Which is what it's like in a spaceship. Um, but maybe Freud would have gone for some other meaning behind the falling, or
yeah,
emptiness, or something with his father, or some
yeah,
instead of intuiting.
I think that was actually, I could be wrong. I think that was not even a dream, but one of his sort of deliberate
Oh,
visual
thought
journeys.
experiments.
So
Yes,
again,
yes.
very similar to the light beam.
Gedanken
Um,
experiments, right?
yeah, exactly, exactly. So again, it's really fascinating because he was kind of doing it, but in his own way. He was using the visual imagination and turning into these, totally revolutionary ideas. And there's many of his critiques of quantum mechanics were also kind of visual or visualizable experiments. And it wasn't like they actually went and collected data and ran these experiments. He proposed these thought experiments to challenge quantum physics, and they always ended up kind of coming back and being able to answer him successfully. But he used that technique over and over again. So
Right. That was visualized in I think it was HBO, did that, I don't know, 10-part series on Einstein's life based on Walter Isaacson's biography, where he's with his fellow graduate student, whoever it was, I forget. And he says, okay, now picture this. The train is moving along here, and two lightning bolts hit at the same time. We're over here on the hill looking down at the train, and the two lightning bolts hit at the same time. But if you're on the train and you're moving,
yeah,
the one lightning bolt is going to hit before the other one, or after, whatever. It's like,
yeah,
and his friend is just not getting it. Like, what? No, they hit at the same time. No, not if you're on the train. The
yeah,
one hits before the other one. So what's the actual reality? Well,
yeah.
it's relativity.
Yeah, it's relative, yeah. Simultaneity is relative, and, um, yeah, that's the kind of the moral of the story, so
That's one of my spirituality lines, is about looking at Andromeda galaxy through my telescope. That the photons of light coming through the eyepiece left, what, 3 million years ago, or whatever, 3 million light years away, 3 million years ago, when hominids were these little Lucy-sized Australopithecines in Africa. It's
right.
it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been traveling for millions of years just to hit your eye and suddenly give you that conscious experience, and it's even more mind-boggling when you look out further into space, or you look at through the telescopes they have now out in orbit, and
Yeah.
it's billions of you. I mean, you're looking literally
Right.
at right after the creation of the universe. That's how old the
Right.
light is. You can
Right.
see the kind of giant glowing explosion after the Big Bang through a telescope because you're looking back in time just as you're looking deep into space. And this is another whole side of things that I didn't get into in the book, but I wrote a whole chapter and ended up getting cut in the end
Hmm.
on the Big Bang. And I mentioned a little bit just in the intro to the book as kind of a bit of a poetic introduction to all this, that, the ultimate conclusion of general relativity, if you start running it backwards, that if that's a good model of the overall structure of the cosmos and the warping of space time, if you run that back, once you realize it's expanding and you run that tape backwards, you get our current model of
Hmm.
cosmic evolution, the Big Bang. And then you have before the Big Bang, you have this really mysterious, completely incomprehensible thing they call the primordial singularity or the initial singularity. Um, and it's, again, you can claim that it's the parallels are a stretch or that they're not valid, but it's very, very similar to what a lot of mystical traditions have been saying, which is that everything looks different, everything looks multiple and separate, but it all has a single source at some point on some
Right.
level. And that's quite literally the conclusion of modern cosmology, derived in large part from Einstein's physics. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole concept of space time and that gravity is not this force reaching out and holding planets to stars. It's that this massive stars are just bending and warping the space time, and the planets are just falling through this warped, the rubber sheet is always the analog, which
yeah,
is not great, but the bowling ball and the rubber sheet, it's not being pulled toward the huge object distorting the rubber sheet, it's just falling. And you have to just kind of run that in your head, just like, okay, that is really weird. And then, but we're so used to hearing it, we've all seen all the endless documentaries. But if you were, Einstein as a graduate student introducing that idea to your professors, that must have just been, what are you talking? How is this What's the math of this?
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it made him world famous. That's how kind of crazy it was when the eclipse expeditions confirmed it, that the distortion, the bending of light was what he'd predicted in his theory. And I think it's a weird situation because I think it's really hard to understand even today unless you're truly a physicist. I think I kind of have the same layman's grasp of it. You're mentioning of the rubber sheet or something, um, and yet even though people didn't understand it, they understood that this was something really wild and revolutionary was happening. And he kind of ended up becoming the first celebrity scientist because of these ideas, which is another kind of interesting episode in his
Oh, it's
life.
always good to remember that, that it didn't happen overnight. I mean, that was his miraculous year. Annum Mirabilis was
Mm.
1905, right?
Yeah.
And so the eclipse experiments are 1919,
Yeah.
and then the New York Times headline and all that was, shortly after that. So you're talking like 15 years. He just kind of ground along, publishing peer-reviewed papers. By the way, I always point this out. He didn't come out of
Yeah.
nowhere. He wasn't just this nobody. Oh, he worked in a patent. He was a patent clerk. Yeah, because he
Yeah.
couldn't get a job, but he had a PhD.
Yeah.
He studied at real institutions with real professors and published
Yeah.
in real peer-reviewed journal. He's not an outsider, really.
Yeah. Or certainly not after the miracle year. Then he was kind of inducted. Although he didn't, I think it took a couple of years to get a real job even after that. It
Yeah.
was still a while before he was recognized. And again, if I recall it correctly, I think it was Max Planck recognized really early on that this was revolutionary work. And I think it was his kind of intervention or his assistance that kind of helped him kind of get a foot into the academic world. But yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, I think general relativity, I think he spent 8 or 9 years kind of slaving away on that
Mhm.
in what turned into a very short paper at the end of the day. But yeah, a lot of labor went into it, and uh, that's another sort of interesting side to all this is that the initial insight, the initial kind of revelation in mathematical terms can be really brief, but turning that into something coherent and rigorous that you can share with the world and that's actually going to stand up to empirical testing
Mhm.
is a whole other
Mhm.
whole other process. So
There's another great scene from the HBO series where he's after he works out the relativity, then he's showing lecturing. Like you think he's in a big room or something, and he's talking about his equations and this and that, and then the camera pulls back and it's one like teenager who he's tutoring. It's like the son of
right.
some famous person, rich person, or whatever. He's
Yeah.
just tutoring this kid. Like, oh,
Yeah.
this is reality, right? Today you'd have a Substack column and a podcast and or whatever.
Yeah. 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 You remind me one of my amazing philosophy professors when I was in college told me the same story about Isaac Newton. Is that he couldn't get anyone to come to his lectures, and it'd be two or three people maybe
Mhm.
listening to this guy. And he's like, "Can you imagine if you were here today? I mean, literally millions of people would line up to listen to what he has to say." And
Mhm.
so,
Yeah,
um,
that's
I
funny.
mean,
Okay, so Einstein, when do you think he became well, we would call an atheist, I guess. He just did not believe in the Jewish God, the God of Abraham, Yahweh. He's raised Jewish, so he's one of the three Abrahamic religions. But when does he reject that and go in search of something else?
yeah, I think very early on is he tells kind of two stories that I think are not contradictory but complementary about that. One of them is reading Kant, and I think that was around the age of 13. Read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, and as I'm sure you know, the kind of the central idea of that whole book is that all our metaphysical speculation is worthless, essentially, that our minds are, today we'd probably call it evolved, but in Kant's lingo, which is kind of, that's the structure of cognition, the structure of the mind is such that it's meant to deal with the external physical world and the way we see it as objects in time and space. And it's just not equipped in any sense to go beyond that and come up with valid conclusions about the metaphysical source of all things, even though Kant argued that there was some ground, again, this sort of divine ground, the noumenon. We were in no position to say anything about it. And that's what most religions are, is exactly that, making speculations or making assertions about what that metaphysical source is.
Mm.
Um, and then the other side of it, there's these books, popular science books by, I think it's Aaron Bernstein. And those were kind of, readable summaries that a teenager could read of what science had discovered in the last few hundred years, and the sort of presenting the figure of the scientist, these great physicists, these people on this quest to understand reality. And Einstein also mentions that as a source of his, not only his skepticism, but that wonder that, wow, there's this whole universe out there, and if we work at it, we can understand it. And here I'm being kind of offered these um, prefabricated answers to all my questions, but there's these people who go out and look for themselves, and that's kind of the path he chose for himself. So I think
Yeah.
philosophy and science were kind of the twin things that um, eroded that belief for him pretty early in life.
Yeah, that's sort of an intellectual journey, but wasn't he also very much bothered by the role of religion in the history of violence and discrimination and bigotry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that came a little bit later. I don't think it's quite as clear that that was the original
Mm,
source of kind of why he lost his faith, because there are stories that he was actually quite religious when he was quite young. Would make up little hymns
mm.
to honor God, and he would, took had an episode where he decided to keep kosher and not eat any pork, even though his family was totally secular, and they were like, "What are you doing, Albert?" But um, yeah, that's something I think that's more of a mature thought, that,
Yeah.
why we need to transcend these second phase religions, even though they're kind of an improvement, even though they offer a lot of solace to people and meaning in their lives, that they're so easily exploited. They so easily line up with entrenched political interests and financial interests and so on, that it's just not something that's going to be tenable going forward.
Let's talk about Einstein's view of the history of religion and why people believe in it. You talk about here, he has just basically kind of three stages or sorts. The third phase, you call it. Like the earliest ancestors, Einstein thought it was above all fear that evokes religious notions, fear of hunger, wild beasts, sickness, death. This is you now. Early humans had no knowledge of the laws of nature, so it was easy for them to assume that when bad things happened, bad intentions had to be behind them. And then you quote Einstein, since at this stage of existence, understanding of causal connections is usually poorly developed. The human mind creates illusory beings, more or less analogous to itself, on whose wills and actions these fearful happenings depend, close quote on Einstein. So there, he's kind of giving a kind of a practical or pragmatic explanation for the origins of religion, an explanation for why bad things happen, something like that.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note too that he gives people a lot of credit for saying, they're trying to figure out why. And
Yeah.
even though we don't agree with those answers anymore, it's the same instinct that the modern scientist has, which is, why are these things happening? What's behind it? How can I change it? Or how can I control my own, destiny, or the bad things happening around me? How can I make sure good things happen? So it's that human curiosity and that kind of quest to understand is there even at the very beginning. And that's kind of how he sees that evolved into, the second phase religions, which are all our religions that are around today, essentially the monotheistic faiths and Hinduism and Buddhism and so on. Um, take that idea to another level where, okay, there's a sort of moral side to this too. It's not just a bunch of evil and good spirits that are all over the place, say, but there's kind of something bigger. There's a moral law or an ethical kind of heart to the universe with the law of karma, for example. And that's a good reason to be a good person. And maybe you don't have to pray here. Maybe you can't fix this particular situation, but overall, you should sort of follow these rules. And in the end, it'll be okay, because you're going to go to heaven if you're good, or you're going to be reincarnated in a better spot if you kind of follow the rules. And that gives people kind of an understanding and an impetus to um, keep on their best behavior essentially. But what it doesn't have is the things we've been talking about, which is the sort of accepting the mystery, and continuing that quest to understand things, feeling that wonder, kind of admitting our own ignorance and accepting that as a starting point for moving forward. So I think that's kind of where that evolution goes, but also where it needs to keep moving forward,
I
where it
forget if
hasn't
you
gone far
have
enough.
that quote from Kant in here. The things that perplexed him were the starry heavens above and the moral law within. Right,
Yeah.
right.
I don't have that quote in there. I do know the quote you're talking about though, and I think, yeah,
Yeah, because so Einstein's second phase here about religion is the social and moral religions. From the understanding of causal relations in creation, evolved the concept of a God of justice. He became humanized and comprehensible. Man could look to him for guidance and consolation. This was the God of providence who protects, disposes, rewards, and punishes, Einstein explained. The comforter in sorrow and unsatisfied longing, he who preserves the souls of the dead. The development from a religion of fear to moral religion is a great step in people's lives, he thought. Nobody certainly will deny that the idea of the existence of an omnipotent, just, and omnibeneficent personal God is able to accord man solace, help, and guidance. So it's almost like an evolutionary sociology model, right? Early on, before people really started asking, studying this problem. You go from, or maybe it's just religion has different functions, right? Explanatory, causal, and then social, moral, and then the third phase. So go ahead and take us into the third phase that Einstein liked.
yeah, and I think what you said is totally true, but there's a sort of a subtler side to it, which he explains is that it's not really a temporal sequence of,
Mm,
this becomes this,
right,
and that's
right,
kind of
yeah,
the end of the story. And,
right.
obviously the third phase is the better religion because it's more recent, and the old, first phase, say, religions are worse. Um, I think he saw the third phase not so much as, Christianity, say, is going to turn into the third phase, but it's this it's almost what you call the perennial philosophy or the Prisca Theologia, from the Renaissance thinkers. And, I'm sure you're aware of Aldous Huxley's book, The Perennial Philosophy, that what Einstein's kind of getting at is actually this unitary mystical idea that people from all kinds of traditions can come to on their own. And if you grow up in Greek culture or in Christian culture, you're going to probably interpret that in the framework of the culture you're embedded in because it's hard not to. But at the same time, what he sort of saw it as is that this is a universal thing that, he found, through mathematics, through science, but other people found through mystical experience, or, really, really rigorous logical, rational thinking, I guess, as you could call it, with Spinoza, for example, or with Kant. Um, and so it's kind of where he thought or where he would like to see us going, but it's also this revival. It's also kind of a rebirth of these really ancient feelings that arise everywhere. And so I think it's really interesting that the people he holds up, who I focus on in the book of, who counts as kind of a predecessor of the cosmic religion, or who's kind of intimating this what I'm trying to explain, or who says it in another way. It's people from all over the world and, separated by thousands of years. And so you have atheist, uh, scientific type philosophers like Democritus. He mentions Francis of Assisi. He mentions Giordano Bruno. He mentions the Psalms of the Bible. He mentions the Buddha and Spinoza, of course. So there's people from all over the place. And it's really not about one tradition is closer. It's about certain people are able to sort of access this and come back with a very similar worldview.
Yeah, well, that's one of the advantages of having a big library. And if
Yeah.
you are
Yeah,
widely
right.
read, I mean, that's
Y
the importance of an education. Now, forget if you make more money or not by having a college education. That's true. Maybe that's good. But more important is you're exposed to the ideas of other people, and there's so many different ones. You can kind of gel from that. Yeah, there's an interesting tension there I'm getting in Einstein that I also mentioned that I get from your own thinking in your book. It is, it's part descriptive, but also part prescriptive. Like,
yeah,
this is the way it is, but here's how it could be.
yeah,
Even better.
yeah. Yeah, and I think it's it's hard enough to I think, understand these ideas or explain them because they're just so unfamiliar today because, I don't know anyone who's a pantheist except maybe me, and I'm not sure. I'll quote Einstein that I'm not sure if I can describe myself as a pantheist, but I think it's pretty close. Um, and then to sort of draw the ethical conclusions from these beliefs that most people have, barely heard of, if at all, is also just a really tough, not a tough sell, but just it's just so unfamiliar. It's just not how people think these days. And that's actually why I spent a lot of time on Gandhi in the book, who Einstein admired as kind of, the highest person living in his time, essentially. I mean, the praise is just kind of, would have made him blush. I'm sure it was just so over the top, and I think justified in many ways at the same time. And Gandhi, I didn't really know this until I worked on the book, that Gandhi has really, really beautiful writings on his spirituality, where it came from, and exactly how he came to this idea of, absolute nonviolence, totally just precluding it in any way, including having armed bodyguards, which he wouldn't allow. And that's how he ended up getting assassinated. And it's quite a direct line, actually, from him, is that, you know, I was raised with the Upanishads, with Jainism. This was kind of the culture I lived and breathed in India. And once you feel that, I think that this is another key point. It's not so much that once you understand these ideas, you're going to behave better. It's much more that you need to have that experience on some level, to some degree. And once you have that experience, the ethics becomes obvious, and it becomes maybe not easy, but totally a natural thing, or something you aspire to do. And that's how Gandhi explained it as well, is that I'm a non-dualist. And so nonviolence is obvious. We're all one thing. We're all one. And I'm not going to go out and harm myself to achieve my own ends. It makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Well, so pantheism, would you apply that term to, Einstein's famous answer to the question, do you believe in God? I believe in Spinoza's God, the laws of nature, or whatever, something like that. Nature itself is God, something like that.
yeah. And I think the caveat Einstein added, which I'll just repeat, is that our mind, he said the problem is too vast for our limited minds. That's kind of the end of the answer to that question from the interviewer. And I think that's a great answer. He said, pantheism is the best answer I can give you. That's a word that we have, or a system that people can understand. But the real answer is we don't understand it at all. And that pantheism is kind of the best or closest approximation so far. Um, and again, it leads to implications which are really hard to understand. Not only a sort of really intense ethics of nonviolence, say, but also admitting that that there is death and evil and destruction in the world. And if you see the world as divine or as holy in some way, then you end up with a sort of, um, not dualistic exactly, but a very different idea of what the divine is, if it's something that also leads to death and dissolution and bad things. And I think the Taoists definitely get this idea, and that's, I think, probably what Einstein saw as so interesting in their system, and why he read the Tao Te Ching so closely, because there is this duality, but unity at the same time. And I mean, the yin yang symbol is the perfect symbol, where you have light and you have darkness, but they contain each other, and most people interpret it as they're moving. It's a moving thing that doesn't sit still, and one thing turns into another, and these things are interlinked, and they're inextricably interlinked. And that's, again, from the Western point of view, that's a really weird idea of what God would be, right? It's all the
Mm-hmm.
bad stuff is the devil, or, you know, flawed human nature, or our bad decisions, or so on. We want God to be just the light part, right? And the darkness,
Mm.
we're not interested in the darkness. um, so that's, yeah, I think, let's leave it there.
Well,
So
that's one of my criticisms of prayer and the whole theodicy and problem of evil. So when good things happen, who gets the credit? God.
yeah,
When bad things happen, who gets the blame? Not God.
yeah,
How convenient. So whatever happens supports your theory. Okay. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
if there is a God, I just can't imagine it being anything we could really comprehend. It's a little bit like, I've had a few of the panpsychists on here, Philip Goff, for example. So the glass with, this is iced coffee, by the way, not alcohol. I'm not Pete Hegseth
Hey, no judgment, no judgment.
or Hitch.
Yeah,
uh, the glass is conscious on some level, and at some point, I'm like, really, what are you talking about? How is this possible? Because we have an idea of what sentience means you have to have a brain and be an animal or something. Maybe plants communicate, so they're sort of sentient, but a glass or a rock, and so again, you'd have to be a god to understand this. I think
Yeah.
so. I think that's one reason why we stumble with these words, pantheism, panpsychism, infinity, eternity, and it's like, whoa, it's
Yeah, I
just
think again, I look at it as they're more like they're not really explanatory. They're more placeholders for our ignorance
yes,
in some sense, where it's
yes,
I don't mean by part of infinity that here's a specific way to
right,
understand all philosophical and religious questions. I don't think that's what Einstein was trying to say either. But um, again, I would come back just because it's such an interesting idea that the panpsychist and Schopenhauer's idea of it is that it's it's more like a potential. It's not so much that the cup has consciousness the same way you do, but
mm,
it has it on an infinitely lower level, let's
mm,
say.
hmm,
And because when you think about it, I mean, it's very pretty much the same atoms and can become a brain, can become conscious. And so either you think that that's some new thing that comes out of nowhere somehow if the atoms are in the right place, or it's an intrinsic potential of the underlying physical reality and can manifest in many different ways. And I think it's easy for us to understand that with animals where, most people would agree that their dog is conscious on some level, but it's obviously a simpler form of consciousness than Einstein, say, or than you and I even. And I think it's clear even looking back on your own life. I mean, if you think about your earliest memories, sure, you're conscious as a young child, but are you conscious in the same way or to the same degree as when your brain is fully matured, fully organized? Clearly not. And that doesn't mean you have less humanity, right? Or that
yeah,
you don't have human rights or whatever it is. But at the same time, it's clear that consciousness can change and become much more comprehensive, much sharper, much more receptive to things. And I said that actually in the intro of the book. I felt that happening to myself even as I wrote this book. And as you read pantheism and study these things really deeply, something changes in your mind where you can see this stuff more clearly
hmm.
on the day to day level, and you can see it. You can kind of appreciate your iced coffee. Also, kind of part of infinity. It's not just your mind. So,
Well, that's why I never liked the analogy. When do the lights come on? When in a
mm,
fetus or whatever, it's like it's
right,
not
right,
a switch. It's going to be more like a dimmer, right? That's why
yep,
I was like Dan Dennett's idea of the degrees of freedom in his book Freedom Evolves. So it's not like the chimp has free will, or we do, and the chimp doesn't, or the chimp does and the dog doesn't. It's just degrees of how much movement you can, how much choice you have, or whatever.
yeah. Yeah, and I think you can extend that all the way down, right? And
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
down to an electron or
Mm,
to a proton
right.
or something. And I think that's kind of how I look at it, at least.
Okay, other passages where I didn't do that, I did my own little
Yeah,
markings. Quoting
the
Einstein
original,
here, with
the
his
original
growing
Mike.
knowledge of the vastness of the universe and its trillions of stars, man must consider it an insult when he is told that his conduct should be motivated by fear of punishment or hope of reward. Right, too simplistic, these anthropomorphic religions. The cosmic religion, in contrast, when this is you speaking now here, would not only tolerate new knowledge, but actually encourage scientific inquiry. Einstein famously maintained that, quote, the cosmic religious feeling is the strongest and noblest motive for scientific research, close quote. What he meant was that the search for deep scientific truth was so demanding and could cause so much friction with society, think of Galileo, that only a kind of religious zeal could keep the quest in motion. So, would you say Einstein's, instead of thinking of science and religion as in conflict, or like Gould's non-overlapping magisteria, that for Einstein they're the same? I don't know, same quest or something like that.
Yeah, I absolutely think he saw it that way. And it's absolutely how I feel on a personal level as well, which is why these ideas
Hmm.
resonated so well with me. And I think again, it's so unusual today that it's hard to sort of grapple with. I think for most people, when you hear it for the first time. But I think there's a great quote. I don't remember who said this, but someone was pointing out that science is such a brilliant innovation that even idiotic people can do it. And that's kind of how I see my own work. It's that once you understand that you can
It's
try
funny.
things and test them and then check if it's real and have other people check to look if you're biased or making mistakes, the incremental progress is almost like automatic, right? You just give money and put people in labs and we start achieving, more detailed understanding of things. But there's another side of science, which is more the synthetic, um, deep theoretical physics side, which is not just accumulating details by looking at the physical world, but uniting all those details into a unified picture on a really fundamental level. And I think most people agree that that's kind of a almost a qualitatively different kind of science where you're really uniting, pretend not just this set of phenomena, but essentially an infinite set of phenomena, right? Where if you have a new law of gravity, you've said something about absolutely everything all over the universe that endures for all of time. And that's very different than saying this is how this gene works or how this cell, this protein or something. That's a very localized understanding on some level. So in that sense is obviously the sense that Einstein cared about science and how he practiced it himself in his own life, and that's where his contributions are. So that kind of science that's almost sort of achieving a transcendental unity of millions, billions of separate phenomena that we've accumulated through observation and through, looking at the stars and so on. That's something different. And that's much more akin to a spiritual journey or mystical experience almost where you're unifying what seems to be separate. So
Right, like Hawking's line about, but what puts the fire into the equations, or the touch paper that lights it on fire? There's something underneath it that we're looking for. And at some point, how would you know if you got there? This is always my problem with theism is, if God is outside of space and time, otherwise he would just be a part of the universe and would have to have a cause like everything else. So who caused God is a legitimate question in that model. So their answer is, well, he's outside of space and time. Okay. How does he or it interact with the stuff? This is, Descartes' problem with the mind. How does the mind, if it's just this non-material stuff, how does it make your muscles move? How does it poke it? What's the
yeah,
force, the causal force? And ultimately we're going to end up with a big question like that. How did this creator, light the whole thing on fire in the first place to get going? I don't know what the answers to those big questions are.
yeah, and I think it's it's no less mind-boggling on some level, but it does sort of solve that problem when you look at it in a non-dualistic way or in a pantheistic or a monist way. Is that that's a delusion essentially, and I think that's something else I like a lot about Einstein's view of things and a lot of his sources as well, like the Upanishads and Spinoza and Schopenhauer even, is that understand, approaching the divine or understanding that substrate, it's not a question of divine grace or being lucky or even being a good person, really. It's overcoming your own ignorance, overcoming the sort of delusional, dualistic way we think that's kind of our default in our minds. And it's about seeing things differently. It's nothing really changes, right? So you could, believe everything Einstein believed and your day-to-day life isn't exactly different. It's not like you enter some different universe or get some new revelation that isn't in front of you. It's everything's there in front of you already. It's all there in kind of a potential form, but we're just not paying attention, essentially. We off put all those or sort of offset all those feelings and all that reverence onto other things that either don't exist or that we kind of imagine exist somewhere else, and we ignore everything that's in front of us as kind of less worthy, less valuable.
Yeah, well, this is, the Wittgenstein problem of language and words, and we use these words, and they have to have some meaning, or how do we even talk? But when people use words like paranormal or supernatural, my response, well, there's no such thing. There's just the natural and the normal, and then the stuff we can't explain yet. And so when
Yeah,
you say, it was supernatural, it's ESP or whatever, or it's a miracle, these are just linguistic placeholders until we figure out, well, what actually caused the cancer to go away or whatever the miracle
right.
was. In the same way that cosmologists talk about dark energy and dark matter to explain these mysteries of galaxies spinning and expanding,
Mm.
accelerating, expanding universe. I guess those are the two mysteries, but they don't mean those as final answers. Like, well, that's the answer. It's dark energy. That's
Yeah,
just, we're just going to call it that. Now we're going to try to figure out what that is.
yeah, yeah. It's the placeholder again, right? Where it's
Yeah.
being willing to have it's basically the difference between like a closed and an open system in physics or intellectually. It's just religions want closed systems. They want to have the answers and have a monopoly on these things. Or at least that's how I sort of think of religion traditionally. And science is an open system that invites challenges, invites progress, invites change. And Einstein's sort of scientific spirituality is a blend of those things where you can have the same religious feelings. You can be asking real questions about what is God or what is the order of the lawful order behind reality. But you're working in an open system where, and Einstein says this over and over again that, I'm not giving you a revelation or some final system. I'm trying to ask good questions and help people lead an ethical life. But all of this is open to, further interpretation or challenge in the future, whether it's his science or his um, spiritual ideas as well. And I think I love what you're saying too about nothing's really supernatural. It's like everything that's happened is in part of the natural domain, at least theoretically. And it's a question of figuring things out better. But there's another side to it too, which I think is really important, and that the quantum physicist and Einstein harped on a lot, is that they're they're the miracles are all around us, and we're just not, again, really not
Mm.
paying attention. And there's actually a great line in one of Heisenberg's books. I can't remember which one, but there where he describes conversations with Einstein about quantum physics, and they're trying to puzzle it through. And Heisenberg saying, I got into physics because I didn't understand why there's any matter at all. Like, why is anything stable? It didn't make any sense. I was like, what are you talking about? There's just atoms. I don't understand why this is so interesting to him. And then I started thinking more deeply about it. And you realize there's these polarized particles. There's positive and they're negative, and they're supposed to go together, and they really want to go together and collapse and not be atoms that are separate, that have separate pieces that are kind of against the rules of nature that wants to kind of collapse everything down to a lower energy state. So even the most basic things, a hydrogen atom that is the stable thing that, without these physical laws in place, that keep it stable the way it is, shouldn't really exist at all. There's so much mystery even in the simplest elements that we take totally for granted.
Mm.
So
Yeah, my favorite example that I use on this is Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff's theory about consciousness that happens inside the microtubules of neurons, in which the wave function collapses in these subatomic particles inside these microtubules inside our neurons, and they collapse in a way that kind of almost like a, I'm getting this right, like a wave that would then interact with the ether, and so people could read each other's minds. I don't think Penrose and Hameroff believe that, but if there was such a thing as psychic power, and it turned out it was just the collapse of the wave function inside neurons that are firing in patterns that interact with your patterns, and so you can read my mind. That would no longer be the paranormal. That wouldn't be ESP. That would just be physics or quantum physics or quantum consciousness or something like that. Ultimately, we're looking for some causal mechanism. And then here's a problem: can you apply all that reasoning to the universe itself? This is the fine-tuned problem. And
right.
the first cause, there has to be a cause. Everything has a cause. The universe came into being, therefore there must be a cause. The cause is God, right? Aquinas. So, but creationists still use that argument. But I'm told by philosophers that's a category error. That you're treating the universe like it's this cup or it's a billiard ball, but it's a different thing entirely.
Yeah.
It's everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, again, that's one of those brain breaking things, right? And I love that old myth or story about, it's turtles all the way down. You
Yeah,
just like, there's a turtle
right,
supporting the world. And what's under
right,
that turtle, it's another one, and it just keeps
right.
going. But I think it's an infinite regress because our minds are, as Kant was pointing out, our minds are set up to look for causes, to, infer things back in time. And it's not only a category error, it's a misuse of mental machinery that is not
Mm.
equipped or evolved for these kinds of questions. Like, it just doesn't work. We cannot imagine things really outside of space and time. We can't imagine existence outside of causality without things coming before other things. We're just not able to think that way. Um, and I think, I, again, it's this kind of a brain breaking thing, but I don't think it's that hard to understand why that's the case, because it's the same as we have certain senses and we can see things in certain colors, but we can't imagine a color that we can't imagine. We just aren't able to do that. We're kind of limited to the way our minds work and the way our senses work. And he's just taking that to another level, which, most people don't want to accept, because they want to have answers to these questions, and they want to believe that it's been figured out and we can have a sort of comforting worldview that we can subscribe to. But
Well, you can't really have an infinite regress. I mean, at some point, you have to stop the causal arrow going back and just say, we're going to start here, right? Like the search for the hard problem of consciousness. What if there is none? What if it's just conscious? It just is. I mean,
Yeah.
is that even a legitimate thing to say? Like, I'm not going to look for the hard problem of consciousness. It just exists. Period. Full stop. That's it. But I don't know. That feels unsatisfactory.
Yeah. I agree with you, but I do think it is the case. And I think it's I could be wrong. I think it's David Chalmers who sort of popularized this idea that
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a fundamental quality and it's not the same as an electron, say, but it's the same kind of fundamental thing. And I think we talked about this earlier, and I think that is closer to the truth, or it's closer to what I would believe or wager anyway, is that it's not so much that mind arises when enough matter is in the right place, in the right formation, but it becomes a much more rarefied conscious thing when matter is arranged in this certain way,
Mhm.
into the shape of a brain, say, with all the electrochemical activity that's going on in there. And yeah, it's again, it's unsatisfying, but I think it's tied in with the same question you're getting at, like, why is there anything at all? And I
Mhm.
think the question, why is there mind in a material world, is not really the right question. It's the same question of why is there anything, the ground, the substance, as Spinoza would call it, why is there anything at all? And the secondary question is why can it manifest as atoms and as conscious experience and as any number of other things? But I do think it's one question at the end of the day, or at least that's how I see it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've dealt with this. Why is there something rather than nothing? And then, well, what do you mean by nothing? And then so
Right.
then,
Yeah.
then you get, well, the scientist means something and the quantum physicists mean something
Yeah.
different. Well, there's these fields, or there's the virtual particles, right, that cause the actual particles to come to, well, where were the virtual particles?
Yeah.
They were nothing. Well, and, there's no space, there can't be any space time. And furthermore, there can't even be any Platonic concepts. There can't be logic or math. And by the way, there can't be God either if there's nothing. And at some point, I don't even know what I'm talking about with the word
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah. I've definitely had that feeling where you hit kind of the wall and you realize. I've also had just weird feelings in writing this book and ever since, that these issues we're talking about, it suddenly hits me that this is actually happening, that this is not just
Yeah.
philosophy. It's not fiction. It's not a book that I'm writing, that this issue is confined to this book or this discussion, that this is literally the situation we find ourselves in this enormous, complex, ancient cosmos. And all these conscious creatures are walking around on this little dirt ball. That's
Yeah.
actually what's happening. And you're like, this is, yeah, no wonder we can't figure this out. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling, and I think Einstein put it really well, is that the most mysterious thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible at all.
Yes.
So,
All
the
right.
fact that we can even grasp any of it, I mean, it's no mystery to him that we couldn't get a final theory really, or fully understand what's happening. But the fact that we understand anything whatsoever is kind of mind-boggling in and of itself, when you consider how complex and ancient and kind of intricate the whole thing is. The fact that we're able to model that quite effectively in many domains is really, really mysterious. So,
Yeah, it's amazing. And, you talked about Einstein's final decades trying to create this unified theory of everything, but we still haven't done it, right? If I understand this right, we
yeah,
still haven't unified the large and the small, the macro and the micro, the general relativity with quantum physics. And so I can't help but wonder, as a historian of science, it's been a long time. I mean, we're talking a century now that people have been
yeah,
working on this problem. Maybe they need something completely different. Maybe
yeah,
string theory isn't the answer at all. Maybe there's some other thing I can't even think of.
yeah,
At what point in the history of science do you say, okay, we've been trying long enough. Let's try something completely different?
yeah. I mean, again, as a total outsider, not a physicist, that's my understanding from reading, people like Lee Smolin, who's a physicist
Right,
in
right,
Canada and Waterloo, which I think he makes a really persuasive case. Peter Voigt, or Voigt, I'm not
right.
sure how you pronounce it. He makes the same point: is that we've given this a fair shake, and
Yeah.
we've got
Not even,
nothing really. I mean,
his
the
book was
math's
called
really,
Not Even Wrong.
yeah, exactly, yeah. Which is a quote from Wolfgang Pauli, who
Yeah.
that's how he sort of dispensed with theories he wasn't a fan of.
Yeah.
Um,
Such a
and I
great
think,
line.
yeah, it's great. Pauli's full of good quips like that. And I think there's something even more intense than that, actually, is that that's a theory that tries to unite all of physics but ignores what you're calling the hard problem. It doesn't even pretend to answer the question of how conscious experience fits into all this. it would be a theory that unifies all the known physical forces that we have sort of figured out so far. Um, and Pauli was looking for something, obviously way ahead of the curve and, very ambitious, that looking not only for a unified theory of physics, but a theory that unified all of physics and the mind at the same time. And that's what he was working on with
Mm,
Carl Jung.
mm.
So, even if we had that, if physicists came up with that, and I think you're right, we need someone of Einstein's caliber, and it's just unpredictable when that comes along, and the conditions are right as well for that person to sort of flourish and use their mind to the full capacity. But it definitely seems like we're at an impasse, and we need something new. We need some new people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I like to invoke Thomas Nagel's line, what is it? That's one thought too many,
Mm.
which I think he was applied to, can you use reason to prove reason, or can you use the inductive method to prove induction is good, or, rationality, is it rational to be rational? His line, that's one thought too many. It's just a tool we use. It works, so we use it.
Yeah.
It just, you're going one step too far. There's no answer down there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I don't think I'm expecting anything in our lifetime necessarily, but at the same time, you see, Einstein's generation, everyone thought physics was kind of wrapped up, right? And it
Right.
kind of were, I think it was Lord Kelvin, or someone famously made a fool of himself by saying, it's physics is over, and it's just we're adding decimal points to the our
Right.
accurate measurements, it's all over. And
Right. And then
um
comes Einstein.
yeah, and nuclear physics and and they didn't even know about the nucleus or the nuclear forces. So I think it's really hard to admit to ourselves, but I think we're walking around in exactly the same kind of worldview where, just as back then, you have the sun, this giant nuclear fire burning literally in front of everybody every single day for all of human history. And everyone's like, it's a bigger fire. There's no mystery there. There's
Mhm.
nothing else to understand. And, physics is done. We've got it all pretty much figured out. And I think, you mentioned dark energy, dark matter. There's already hints that that's happening in our world now and in cosmology. Um, but I think, when someone comes along and points it out, eventually, I think that's it. That's exactly how we're going to feel, is that, oh, how could we have ignored this so long? We thought we had this complete model, and yet literally staring us in the face
Mhm.
all day, every day, there's this whole unexplained thing that requires new theory, new kinds of physics. And I think, again, it's hard to admit because we don't see our own blind spots, but that's what the history of physics shows, is that what everyone sort of assumes is needs no explanation actually does require an explanation, and really new things, new forms of physics and science. So,
Yeah. Kelvin was skeptical of Darwin's theory because the Earth wasn't old enough.
right,
And the universe is just not old enough. And this was before, radioactivity was discovered, and that,
right,
that this was a different source of heat. And so he just had a kind of a billiard ball model, as it were, of an object that was super hot, and then it cooled down, and you just calculate how long it takes an object this size to cool down, and then multiply by the size of the Earth or the sun. And,
uh,
you'll get a few million years, but not enough for Darwin's evolution. And then, within a few decades, that all went away. So, yeah, you just can't help but wonder, this one reason why I'd like to be chronically frozen and brought back in 500 years ago. Oh, so that's what consciousness is.
right,
Oh,
right,
it's obvious.
yeah,
Why didn't I see that? Damn it.
yeah,
Okay, here's another problem in your conscious freedom chapter, because this is another one of these big ones that niggles away at my brain, is free will and determinism. So
right,
Einstein was a determinist. Okay, everything, here he is, you quote him, everything is determined, the beginning as well as the end, by forces over which we have no control. It is
mm,
determined for the insect as well as for the star. Human beings, vegetables, or cosmic dust, we all dance to the mysterious tune. And then you outline the paradox for him. Here,
mm,
Einstein's position seems deeply paradoxical. He claims we had no control over actions, but he called on courageous individuals to inspire others to act more nobly. He insisted on the unbreakable necessity of natural law, but he pleaded with us to change the course of history and build a more peaceful world. He held that humans had no real moral responsibility, but he summoned us to create our own high ethical standards and live up to them. It seems as if Einstein's ideas are irreconcilable, if not darn right contradictory. Yeah, it sure seems like it. And I have to say, every determinist I've ever met, or whose book I've read, I think they don't actually believe this. They can't possibly believe. They
mm,
wouldn't walk around the world. They wouldn't do anything So how do
Right.
you square that circle? How did Einstein do
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. I think this was also a really fun part of the book to write because it was a departure from kind of the Einstein as the saint presenting all the answers for us,
Yeah.
and instead showing him as a really a human being grappling with these really ancient questions that just don't seem to have a solution. And um, is also one of my favorite lines I wrote in the book was, we might be forgiven for thinking that someone as original as Einstein, a genius of his caliber, might have finally solved this problem
Yes.
for us, but prepare to be disappointed because
Right.
it's all over the place and it is contradictory. But I think there's a great book by, I think it's Goldberg or Goldman, I forgot, but who also wrote a little book about Einstein's religion, and he came to, I think, what is the correct answer for Einstein, which is that he started to see it as that's basically true for almost everything, but humans are a little bit special because we can sort of exert this conscious influence on our own behavior, and we can become conscious of our instincts and our impulses. We have this little narrow opening through which we can attain some control over our behavior, um, and sort of evolve spiritually, let's say, to become a bit more free and exert some force on the world that isn't just determined. And I mentioned this in the book. That's a pretty much the centerpiece of every serious spiritual school and every religion is that, you know in Christianity, say you have free will is kind of a default option, but by no means do we actually exercise that all the time. The devil or our own laziness or um, temptation and so on leads us away from that. So it's not that we're actually totally free; it's that we're potentially free, and it's almost a paradox of discipline equals freedom, right? It's that
Hmm.
the more disciplined you are, the more you're following the higher path. You're saying no to all the bad things and yes to the good things. Um,
Did you
and
just quote Jocko Willink?
I think I did, yeah, I did.
Nice.
Yeah, discipline
Discipline
equals
equals
freedom.
freedom.
I forgot
Nice.
about that, but yeah, I'll give him a plug because, he's a Navy SEAL and, definitely not a vegetarian, but,
No.
he I think it's a brilliant insight that I actually really, really love, and I'll give credit to that because I was when I started working on my first draft of a first book, which is not what this book is, but I was really afraid to just start, cold calling publishers and agents and sharing what I'd written. And I actually found that book. I saw him on a podcast or something. I read that book and he said, get after it. Everyone's afraid. Everyone is scared of failure, scared of being hurt, scared of dying, whatever it is. And that's freedom and that's courage as you go after the things. And literally the same day I sent it out and started this
Nice.
process. So yeah, but not total
Nice.
aside
That's a
there. But
great
from
story.
Einstein to Jocko Willink.
That's
um,
really funny. Yeah,
but
his point for listeners not familiar with him. Yeah, his book is Discipline Equals Freedom. He has a few other books too, but the idea is that the wrong question is what is my motivation, or I need more motivation and I'm just not motivated to get up in the morning and work out. Wrong word, not motivation. It's discipline. And when you make that transition, you realize, well, no one likes getting up at 5 in the morning and working out, right? But you just do it. You're just
right,
disciplined, and then that's what frees you up. Don't search for the hack to the trick to get to motivation. That's the wrong
yeah,
quest.
yeah, and to bring it back to sort of your original question after our little aside here with
Oh yeah.
Jocko Willink, but I think what Goldman came to, which I came to on my own too, and I was really really cool to see the same argument made in his book, is that it's I use the analogy in the book actually of the Earth and the sun, and we say, oh well, the sun causes the Earth's orbit. It causes the Earth to rotate around it, and yeah, almost completely true, except that the Earth also exerts a gravitational pull, and the Earth
Hmm.
also pulls on the sun, and so the orbit's actually the mutual kind of the sum of those two parts. Also, the sum of the influence of the other planets in our solar system and Jupiter and so on. So all these things are exerting an influence and the overall, say, curvature of space-time gives you the orbit is the sum of all those influences. But because of the sun so much bigger and so much more massive, we can ignore all that for all intents and purposes, and it doesn't make much difference. And we can just say there's one cause and then there's the effect, and it's that simple. But again, with something like Jupiter, it gets a bit more complicated. And actually, to get an accurate model of Jupiter's orbit, you do need to take that into account because Jupiter's having its own influence. And in a dual star system, two stars, which star is orbiting which star? It's the wrong question entirely, right? There's no first causal agent. It's a mutual interaction that mutually determines. And so this is what Goldman comes to, is that even this little piece called a human being, or called Albert Einstein, um, for most purposes, the rest of the universe has decided everything for us. And there's these laws of gravity and electromagnetism and all our evolutionary heritage and our instincts, all that, immense amount of stuff is kind of converging on us and determining most of our lives and determining the bounds within which we can perceive and think and act, as we've been discussing this whole time. And yet, you're also a little piece that exerts influence on the things around you. You have your own little gravitational field because of the mass of your body. So there's kind of a beautiful side to it, is that you're interconnected with this tapestry, but every part plays a role and every part has an influence as well. So again, it's not a traditional notion of freedom or free will where
Yeah.
you just can do anything you want, but at the same time, it's not a total negation of free will, even though it is deterministic in some sense.
Here's what you write. Although we couldn't claim to be free in any fundamental sense, libertarian free will, there's no homunculus in there making decisions for us. And if there were, there'd be a little homunculus inside the homunculus, so that doesn't get
Right.
us anywhere. We still exerted a force in the world like the feeble pull of our own little planet on the sun. No matter how small the role, every person had a part to play. Quoting Einstein here, each of us has to do his little part toward transforming the spirit of the times. Then you, our inextricable ties to all things everywhere meant we inevitably impacted the world around us. Our actions rippled and reverberated through all of reality. Then you're quoting Einstein again. Human beings are not condemned to be at the mercy of a cruel, self-inflicted fate. What we do is of supreme importance to all humanity, to history, to human destiny. I mean, that's such a powerful statement. So again, what he's saying is this, because everything is interconnected, there's a unity to the whole cosmos. Just like the little moon does its thing that affects, the 40 moons around Jupiter or whatever has its effects. Everything we do has some sort of an effect. But you have to make one more move. That is to say, I'm aware that I can do this. And because I have a memory, I know what I did before and I can do something different. Jocko, okay, I'm going to do
Yeah.
something different tomorrow. I'm going to set up the conditions now, knowing that future Shermer is going to be weak at 5 a.m. and not want to work out. So I'll have all my workout clothes ready to go, right? I can plan that. So although I'm determined in a way, I guess, or highly influenced to be lazy and slothful at 5 a.m, current me knows that and can change the future.
Yeah.
So I'm part of the causal net of the universe. I'm the universe is determined, but I'm part of the causal determining net of the universe. Something like that.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of what you were saying earlier, like, where do you draw the line? Because there is no line. You can't just say like, well, this is this little piece, and once it's free or once it understands that, now it does what it wants. Like, you can't break off the influence energetically, physically, socially. All that stuff is always there, um, but it does feed back in. And I think you hit the key point there too, which is that even if you were totally unconscious, you'd still be having that influence on the world, but it would be completely determined by the inputs, right? It just kind of input
Mhm.
equals output, and that's just how it is. And it's being processed through your automatic instincts or whatever. Um, but as you become conscious of it, I think the phrase I use in the book is, agency is, in the philosophical sense of, freedom or being a free agent. Agency has to be earned. You have to become consciously aware and sort of practice it almost, or align it with some inner ideal of what the behavior you want to be putting out into the world, as opposed to just, our ancient ape instincts and just,
Mm.
me first and I'm hungry and I want this and I want that. Um, you kind of set up this inner ideal, is how Einstein talks about it. You cultivate this ideal of a more harmonious society, a more harmonious way of living. And then you make decisions on what you put out into the world and the actions you make and the words you say, based on this really ethereal thing that is not obviously out in the world, or it's not, a chemical or energy influencing you. It's this very subtle thing that human minds have come up with. And he looks back to the past with that too, and he specifically cites the Chinese sages and the Greek philosophers as coming up with kind of the best models of what that looks like, of this sort of free, curious, open-minded person who has compassion for others. Um, Not only can you have that sort of subtle idea that can be the sort of ideal you set your behavior to, but other people have had these ideas before and you can learn from them. You don't need to come up with it all by yourself.
Yeah, I guess you really wouldn't even need to be conscious of what you're doing. If you just say, I want to make the world a better place, I'm going to be a virtuous person just for its own sake. And then there may be, a million things I do in the course of a lifetime that affect other people, and I don't even know I'm doing it. It's just the role of contingency. Just things just happen, and who knows, what would have happened had I not been there. This is the theme of Wonderful Life, the movie that Gould wrote his book on contingency, which he called Wonderful Life, in which, the Jimmy Stewart character gets a replay. He's about to kill himself. So his angel says, all right, let's rerun the tape without you in it. And you'll see all the different things that would have happened had you not been there. And then they do that. And he's like, oh my God, I had no idea that I was an important person. But the moral of the story is we're all like that. Just 1,000 trillion little things you do. You go left instead of right. You hold the door for some, whatever. That's maybe the deeper moral implications or ethical implications of this worldview is that we're all interconnected. And so most of the time you have no idea what effects you're going to have. So just act accordingly and, who knows what effects you have.
Yeah, like you said, you don't know, and you're creating ripples for better or worse, and you just don't know the knock-on effects of what you're doing. And um, I think that's also a really interesting point historically that someone like Pythagoras is almost forgotten, and look at the ripples thousands
Mm.
of years later. People who wrote the Upanishads and having these mystical experiences and sitting down with disciples, and then someone writes down the conversations more or less as they remember them, and these things persist because we have cultural memory, we have stories, we have writing, of course, now. Um, I think that makes it much, much more influential in some way or much more important that um, we do preserve these things. So we just don't know, but it's worth sort of sharing these ideas and
Hmm.
trying to enunciate them clearly because who knows where they're going to end up.
Yeah. Do you know what the block universe is? Have you heard of this block universe? It's
It's
a
just where there's no time
Y y
or not really,
y
like it's
yeah,
all,
everything's already
yeah,
happened. It's all done.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
it's just picture a big block of, I don't know, loaf of bread or whatever, and we're the little slice
Cosmos.
here, the big bang is here, the end is here, and we're right.
Yeah.
It's already happened, and so that God is outside watching the movie or whatever. Um, that I think could refute what the argument we just made for free will or volition, because if it's already happened, but you see, if you're in the block universe, then now that wouldn't apply, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think monism, non-dualism, I think that is kind of a block universe on some
Mm,
level, and I think it's just a different way of describing kind of the same thing. And
mm,
Einstein points this out. He says this in many different ways that time's an illusion ultimately, and it's a
right.
it's a really it's a really convincing illusion, but it's not really true. And um, again, this is in Kant as well, and in Schopenhauer, this is like fundamental to both of their philosophies. Is that time I mean, we talked about causality being it's hard enough to sort of think back and not use causality to explain the origin of the universe. But if you accept what they're saying in their philosophies, that space and time too are just cognitive constructs. They're just like a grid that our brain lays down on something that is eternal and infinite and does not have boundaries and it doesn't have a flow of time. This is something you can't prove, but certainly something that's been very clearly explained and argued for by really, really brilliant philosophers. And I think there are moments I've had, I think Einstein talks about these moments too, where you can kind of suddenly step outside of that and, like you said, see the block. You sort of
Hmm.
understand that you are the block or you're part of the block. But it's really hard to hold on to that. And it's even harder to put it into words or, put it into a book.
I'm looking
After,
for that quote from Einstein to his friends about. Oh yeah,
oh
Michele
yeah.
Besso.
Yeah.
He writes to the family of his friend after the friend died. He
Right.
has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubborn illusion. What do you think he meant by that? Was he just
Yeah, I
being
think it's
polite?
yeah. I think it's I think it's what we've been talking about this whole time pretty
Yeah.
much is that like I said, it's not just that multiplicity is an illusion, or that the difference between mind and matter is an illusion, but it's all distinctions are an illusion
Mm.
on some level.
Hmm.
And it's not just the one and the many, but it's the past and the present and the future. It's mind and matter. It's and any distinction we can come up with is, perhaps useful from an evolutionary point of view or convenient from the point of view of science and doing physics, but it's not reflective of the ultimate truth behind things. Um, and again, these are really hard things to talk about. They're really hard things to
Yeah.
even grasp when you're having these mystical type experiences. But if I had to put my money down, I would agree with it, and I think
Yeah.
it's closer to the reality than dividing things up into little pieces and pretending that's the sort of the fundamental reality of it. So
Yeah, it's probably maybe it's a category error to ask, where does my soul go after my body dies?
right,
Maybe that's not even the right question, but that's the one we ask because I guess we're natural born dualists. Here's Einstein at age 50 asked, "Do you believe in God?" I'm not an atheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. So I think you quoted this earlier. We're in a
yeah,
position of a little child entering a huge library. Oh yeah, you did mention this.
yeah,
Um, yeah, let's see. I cannot conceive of a personal God who would directly influence the actions of individuals who would sit in judgment of creatures of his own creation. My religiosity consists of a humble admiration of the infinitely superior spirit that reveals itself in the little that we can comprehend about the knowable world. That deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God. Yeah, Spinoza's God. Right. Yeah, and I sent you those letters that we published
right,
in
yeah,
Skeptic. I mean, just that Einstein, that some sailor on a ship in the Pacific during World War II would write to Einstein, and that he would write back. That's
yeah,
astonishing.
yeah,
I mean, what a guy.
yeah. There's lots of again stuff that didn't make it into the book just because it had no place, but there's so many sort of charming, down to earth stories about him that I think, largely seem to be true. And there's no reason not to believe them of how, his mind is off in these celestial realms almost, but in terms of human interaction, he's so down to earth. And I mentioned stories about his animals. There's all these pets in the house that he really loves, his cat and his dog, and he's got a parrot. And this is not some super nerdy, holier than thou person off living in some other world. And there's great stories about his later years in Princeton too, of helping a little girl with her
Oh,
homework. And he said,
right.
"Oh, I heard you're a good mathematician. Can you help me with my homework?" And he's like, "Well," I think she tried to bribe him with some candy or something. She
Yeah,
brought. um,
yeah, that's a great one.
so yeah, I think there was something else you touched on there that I was trying to come back to as well. That oh yeah, that it's it's not just the God as the spirit of the order or the harmony in the universe, but he hints at this numerous times, and I think it's a whole other layer to it that's really important. Is that your mind is part of that too. It's not just that you
Hmm.
know the spirit of the universe made you intelligent enough to grasp the pieces, that you are a part of it. Your mind is a manifestation of that same underlying spirit or that underlying order, and that's not only how you understand it, but also how you fit in with everything else. And again, it's not just a spatial temporal analogy that, oh, every little piece is part of the whole. It's that the mind too, and the insights you have, the scientific revelations you have, this is part of that underlying thing at the same time.
We have to admire in humility and beautiful harmony of the structure of this world as far as we can grasp it. And that is all. That's a lot.
Yeah.
That's such a great line.
Yeah.
These
You can
little
spin it
snippets.
out into an entire book. I
I mean,
can.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you did. Um, I mean, there's something about Einstein that just makes him so quotable. I think
Yeah.
it's a little bit maybe like the Stephen Hawking effect, just a genius so far beyond us mortal minds that you want to turn to him for deeper, political, economic, religious. I mean, he had all these ideas about a one world government and we should share our nuclear secrets with the Russians or whatever. Like, hang on, stick with physics and maybe
Yeah.
spirituality, right? But there is there's an appeal there about people with minds like that. Newton was like that. Richard Westfall's biography of Newton has a very moving opening passage where he's, it's been my privilege as a college professor to meet, some of the greatest minds of our time. But when I encountered Newton, I mean, it was like he was on a whole nother plane of existence, not personally, but just through the archives, right? And
Yeah.
you get that feeling about Einstein, maybe Darwin, just so far above everybody else that you want to turn to him and say, okay, what about God? What about this or
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too that I go through in the book how people accused him of being opaque and not explaining himself well, and I'm like, it's all right there. Actually, he's a pretty eloquent writer actually for the most part, and it's a bit of a unique style and sort of the German tradition of these almost aphoristic phrasings of things. But there's hardly any fluff at all. It's these very spare, with carefully chosen words. He's pretty clear. It's Spinoza, Democritus, Pythagoras. Um, he's pretty clear who the sources are and what the implications are. And I think it's really, I mentioned in the opening of the book. It's
Mhm.
not that he's too esoteric or he's too smart for the rest of us. Is that he's asking too much, and we don't want to sort of accept the demands he's making that science and spirituality are one, that mind
Mhm.
and matter are one. It's too much for people to accept or to grapple with. So that's the real barrier, I think.
And that's if you're, sort of not religious at all, like us. If you were traditionally religious, it would be even more difficult if you have a anthropomorphic idea of a deity that knows
Right.
we're here, cares about us, and so on. Yeah. All right, let's wrap this up here. The conclusion of your book. As this book comes to a close, I'm well aware that I've circled endlessly around the center without entering the innermost sanctum. The most essential questions, how exactly we can reach the infinite and what can we expect to find in this higher realm, remain unanswered. This omission was not so much an intentional choice as an inevitable outcome. In approaching anything as arcane as the essence of pantheism, the nature of knowledge, the origins of inspiration, or the expansion of consciousness, the written word can only take us so far. There's something ineffable in all this, something unsayable that can only be experienced on an individual level. Right. Wow. Perfect. What a great book. Kieran, so if I
Thanks.
see you at the Esalen Institute next month in Big Sur, we should go down the coast where Carl Sagan stood on the bluffs there in the opening of Cosmos, where he says the
Yeah,
universe is the cosmos is all that is, ever was, and ever will be, and the crashing of the waves and all of that. That is spiritual gold.
yeah, yeah. Look forward to it.
Amazing.
I hope I can go you down there in a few
All
weeks.
right,
So
thank you. Here it is again. I'm Part of Infinity. Check it out. It's a great read. The Spiritual Journey of Albert Einstein. Here he is, our hero. All right. Thanks, Kieran.
yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Michael.